Okay, so this is a continuation of the explanation of the pretest that you have had in the previous video. But we are now in lesson 5, the development of theory under the theories of crime causation. So again, your presenter, your lecturer is Darlito Bernard G. Delizo, known as Tatay D or Sir D or Dr. D. So the objective of this lesson, at the end of the um, discussion, the learners are expected to explain the stages of theory development or how a particular theory develops out of empirical studies or out of hypothesis or whatever. Then to apply the kind of reasoning in a given scenario, meaning what are the kind of reasoning when you are trying to speculate something, you reason out and then you're now going to apply the kind of reasoning, the inductive, the deductive, and the abductive reasoning. So before we discuss the questions, explain them, we have the concepts of theory development. So these are the concepts, okay? So when you develop a theory, first thing first, is it a speculative one? Meaning you're just trying to speculate something that a particular thing or a particular event or a particular happening, okay, you try now to explain, you try now to uh, give light on a particular occurrence. So for example, in crime, say there is a rising incidence of road rage in a particular city. So you're now going to speculate. You might say now that the road rage caused by uh, is caused by lack of traffic education. Okay, so that is your speculation. So that's already what you call your a theory. But you are now speculating that road rage or yung gulo sa kalsada, away sa kalsada, is caused by lack of traffic education. The second one is after you have that speculations, you're now going to have that descriptive, okay, concept. You now gather descriptive data to describe what is really happening. So you start now to gather data from that particular city, uh, perhaps investigating or interviewing people, or gathering data from police records, who are the people who were involved in road rage, or what are the possible reasons bakit nagkaroon ng sagutan or away doon sa kalsada. Then you're now going to try to describe what is really happening, or what is really the reason why there is an increase in road rage in that city. Then after that, you're now going to, we call it on the constructive concept of theory development. So in the constructive, you may revise now the old theories. Okay, you may revise the standard theories, or you may revise your speculation, or you may develop one based on continuing research. And letter number 3, practically is applied when you are doing a grounded theory research, in which you are trying now to come up with a theory that may, we call it generally, speak of something or may explain a phenomena. We are going to discuss that further later on, what is grounded theory. So this is now the question number 3. Which of the following is not speculative? Okay. Seductive and skin-revealing dress causes sexual abuse against women. So it's only an speculation. Okay. That you're just trying to speculate that the causes of sexual abuse is due to their seductive and skin-revealing dresses. The rising cases of COVID-19 in the country is due to lack of discipline. So that is also an speculation. Okay, you are trying now to speculate or to assume that the rising case of COVID-19 is because of the lack of discipline of the people, and criminologists are the most corrupt police officers. So you are trying now to speculate that being a criminologist, okay, would make a police a corrupt police officer. So letter C is still a kind of speculation. The total number of COVID-19 cases places the country as 20th in the world. So that is not speculative, but rather you are now describing. It's a descriptive of the data that the Philippines became the 20th. I don't know today what number now is the country insofar as COVID-19 cases is concerned. So A, B, and C, more or less, these are speculations. Okay? Letter D is more of a descriptive of a given data. So three kinds of reasoning. So you are familiar with the inductive and the deductive. I don't know if you are familiar with the abductive reasoning. So inductive, a process of using examples. So you start from examples and observations. So you start from specific examples and observations before you are going to reach conclusions. Or you may first gather specific data or information before you can draw a conclusion. On the other hand, deductive is more or less a, uh, a vice versa of the inductive. You start now from a conclusion or a general assumption, and then you are now going to, we call it, assume that your assumption is true, and later on you are going to gather data to support your conclusion or your assumption. So it's the other way around. On the other hand, abductive reasoning is also known as retroductive reasoning. You begin with an incomplete set of observations. So incomplete, unlike in inductive that you have already started with complete observations, but in here you have an incomplete observation, incomplete hypothesis and assumptions. You have not assumed everything. Okay? So because you are not assuming everything, or you're not stating every assumptions or hypothesis that you can make to explain a particular phenomena, because you would like it that later on, as you conduct the research or as you conduct the study, you are open to introduction of other assumptions that may be supported from the data that you are gathering. Okay, and you proceed to the likeliest possible explanation later on for those hypotheses or assumptions. To understand further, we use your module. In inductive, 90% of humans are right-handed. So basically, that is a specific information. You're saying that 90% of human beings are right-handed. And then another specific uh, information is that Joe is a human. Therefore, you have now the probability or the conclusion that Joe is right-handed. Okay? So again, that is specific. So finally, if you are required to guess, okay, whether we call it Joe is right-handed or not, then more or less in the absence of any other evidence, okay, you just started it from the specific information and data, then you will guess now that Joe is right-handed in the absence of any other evidence. That's the problem in inductive. Unlike in abductive, you may get other evidence so that you will have a greater conclusion whether Joe is right-handed or left-handed. On the other hand, in deductive, you start from the conclusion that all men are mortal, and specifically, John is a man. Okay, and again, your conclusion is specific. You're just concluding that John is mortal. So your conclusion here is very specific. On the other hand, if we go back to the inductive, your conclusion is generic or general. Okay, that your conclusion is that Joe would probably be right-handed because he is a human. On the other hand, in here, you started from the conclusion that all men are mortal, so you have your specific John is a man, therefore John is mortal. So your conclusion here is more of a specific on your subject of study, who is John. What about abductive? Okay, so in your given example, you're a juror. For those who do not know what is a juror, in America they use a jury system in which they choose people of good standing in the community to act as judges in cases of criminal cases in America. Okay, so you're part of that jury, and the defendant looks like the image of the man on the security camera robbing the bank. He stutters. When he talks, he stutters. Okay, and pauses. So patigil-tigil yung kanyang pagsalita, like he is guilty when answering questions posed by the prosecutor. Then you conclude as a juror on your first day as a member of the jury that he is guilty. From your, you are now trying to conclude that he is guilty based from the initial information that you have taken note. And what is that? What are those initial information? He looks like the defendant, or he looks like the image of the man who was robbing a bank, and the reaction of the man when he was questioned in the court. Okay, so based from those initial information, you are now trying to conclude that we call it that man or the accused is guilty as charged. However, you are not yet certain because you'd like to have more evidence on that. Okay, so in here you made a decision based on your observation, but you are not certain it is the right decision. So you'd like more. You would like more concrete evidence to support your conclusion that indeed this person is guilty or not. Further, if we try now to place them side by side, inductive, Rojan is a man. So it's a, we call it, you are starting from a specific fact that Rojan is a man and Rojan is mortal. So your, we call it, your conclusion is that all men are mortal, basing it from the specific information or specific fact that Rojan is a man and Rojan is immortal. On the other hand, the deductive, you again start from the general conclusion that all men are mortal. So Rojan is a man, therefore Rojan is a mortal. Okay? On the other hand, on the abductive, you also start from a generic, we call it an initial conclusion that all men are mortal and Rojan is mortal. So therefore Rojan is a man. Okay? So you are just basing your conclusion that Rojan is a man because Rojan is mortal. So you do not know whether Rojan is a man or not. Whether Rojan is a kind of animal, a name for an animal, a name for your dog. So you are now basing your initial conclusion that Rojan is a man. So that's the difference between the deductive and the abductive. On the other hand, on the deductive, you are sure that Rojan is a man. Okay? Therefore, you are now concluding based on the fact that all men are mortal, so Rojan is mortal. On this abductive, you are not yet sure whether Rojan is a man. So, based on the initial speculation that all men are mortal and Rojan is mortal, you are now trying to conclude that Rojan is a man. So, that is the difference between the deductive and the abductive reasoning. Okay, so further explanation will be like this. In inductive, suppose you do not know what is the course of the students in the classroom. So you do not know the courses of the people in the classroom. And then you take one out, then you ask somebody, okay, that man in green, and he came out. And it turned out that man is a criminal student. So from that specific information, you are now trying to infer or conclude that all the students in the classroom are criminology students. Okay, that's the idea. Okay, so on the other hand, deductive, suppose a classroom contains only criminology students, and you are asked now to and you ask one student to come out. So you said, okay, you man in red, please come out. And he came out, and you know already that those people in the classroom are all criminology students. So you may now infer that that particular student whom you asked to come out from the room is a criminology student. So you begin from generic to, we call it, to specific. On the abductive, on the other hand, suppose you find a student near the vicinity of the classroom. Okay, so here's a classroom, and there's a student outside. So that is an initial, we call it, those are initial information. A student and a classroom containing criminology student. Okay, so since that student is found at the vicinity of the classroom, then you may infer now that the student came from the classroom. Say, I know that that student came out from the classroom. So those are just, you are not yet certain because you have not actually seen the we call it the man or the boy, okay, coming out from the we call it from the classroom. So you are now trying to infer. Inference means it is again an assumption. Inference is just like a we call it the thing that you can conclude out of something. That's the idea of inference. So deductive reasoning is best exemplified by the following. After conducting the crime scene investigation, the duty investigator could not determine the identity of the suspect because of lack of trace evidence. He then listed names of possible eyewitnesses, and for the next 5 days, he interviewed the witnesses. So in here, there is no conclusion yet as to the identity of the suspect. Okay, so there is uncertainty. And after that, the investigator tried now to, we call it, list um, possible eyewitnesses, and then he interviewed them so that he can come up with the identity of the suspect. So this one, letter A, is basically an inductive reasoning, an inductive approach of investigation, where you gather first information, gather first specific evidence, and from those evidence, you try now to, we call it, create your theory out of the crime, or the theory on the motive of the crime. Letter B, a criminal investigator, upon arrival at the crime scene, discovered a naked dead woman with multiple stab wounds. Based on the appearance of the victim, he assumed that the woman was sexually abused, then stabbed to death because the assailant may be known to her. Okay? So in here, it is starting from, we call it, from a generic assumption. So he tried now to, the investigator assumed already that the woman was sexually abused because of the, we call it, the appearance that the woman was naked. And he was stabbed to death because he is known by the assailant, or he knows, or she knows the assailant, okay? Or she knew the assailant. So in here, he is starting from a common inference that the idea here is that you do not need to be a police officer to come up with an assumption that that woman was sexually abused because she was naked. Okay, so that is a generic assumption. That is a common assumption that when a woman is found dead, naked, then even an ordinary person, if ever he sees that woman naked, then he could come up with a generic assumption that that woman was sexually abused. So that's generic. Okay. Then letter C, a social media outfit conducted an investigative reporting in relation to alleged extrajudicial killings of suspected illegal drug personalities. After a month, the investigative reporters noted varied reasons of EJK. So this one, letter C, is a little bit of abductive, okay? Because you do not have yet, we call it, one concrete explanation as to the causes of extrajudicial killing, okay? And of course, it could also be more of an inductive, this statement, because you are starting, or you started with the gathering of facts. Okay, you started gathering facts. Then later on, you came up now with the we call it with the explanation of the extrajudicial killings. And later D, with the rising COVID-19 cases in a certain city, the mayor deployed city marshals to roam around the city to determine the possible causes of the phenomenon. And after 3 days, the city marshals reported the city mayor to report their findings. So in here, uh, you are, we call it doing an inductive reasoning. Why? Because you are trying to gather, or the police officers or the marshals, they started gathering specific information. Okay? So more or less, this still a kind of, you begin with an inductive. Okay? You begin with an inductive approach of investigation. So your answer here is letter B. That is a deductive starting from a generic assumption. Okay? You started from generic assumption. So later on, if you would like to complete this letter B, the investigator will gather evidence to support his theory that the woman was sexually abused, or that the assailant may be known to the woman. Okay, so letter B, you started with a generic assumption. On the other hand, letter A, letter C, and letter D, you started from a specific, we call it approach, in which the investigators there, the marshals, started by gathering specific informations. So the analysis now, there are weaknesses to these kinds of reasoning, particularly deductive and inductive. In deductive reasoning, it is criticized for the lack of clarity in terms of how to select jury to be tested via formulating hypotheses. In other words, there may be some biases because you already have a conclusion. So you are just trying to gather evidence to support your conclusion. So the problem, if you are an investigator, you may discard an information or evidence that may not support your conclusion. That is the problem with deductive. Say on the case that we have mentioned a while back. So in your conclusion, or in your theory that the woman was sexually abused by a known assailant, okay, as you gather evidence, as you progress in your investigation, the problem there is that once you gathered or collected the evidence that may be pointing to a different direction, meaning it may not support your inference or your initial theory of the crime, okay, that is the problem. That's where the problem comes in. Okay, you will tend to be biased on your, we call it investigation. On the other hand, okay, on the inductive reasoning, it is also criticized because no amount of empirical data will necessarily enable theory building. Meaning, if you just, we call it, base your conclusion on the initial data that you gathered without conducting further investigation, that would be the problem. If you just, we call it, if you'll just stick on the initial data that you have. Okay? So it's more or less, we call it like a deductive reasoning, where you are already firm in your inference or your generic inference. On the other hand, the abductive reasoning, it already overcame the those weaknesses by adopting a pragmatist perspective. And what is pragmatism, or what is pragmatism, or what is pragmatic? When you say pragmatic, it's like you are dealing with things sensibly and realistically in a way that is based on practical rather than theoretical consideration. In other words, in abductive, you try now to go to the real situation. You try now to go to the real life thing, no? What is really happening. You are now going to dig deeper on what are the real things, or the practical things, or what is really happening in the community. Okay? So you are now going to deal with the problem, you are now going to deal with the issue by, we call it, considering the reality of what is going on in the community before coming up with your explanation of a certain phenomena. So that is pragmatism or pragmatist perspective. Kaya abductive, you have an initial information, so you do not still, we call it, you do not still stick on that initial information, but rather you would like to know the real situation. Okay? So that's, it will all the more, okay, make your findings better, or we call it more realistic. Okay? So, in theory construction, uh, your assumptions or the main purpose of the theory is to provide the means to develop mathematical, analytical, and descriptive models that will predict counterintuitive, non-obvious, unseen, or difficult to obtain outcomes. So, in other words, uh, when you are doing research on the causation of a criminal activity, okay, so you have a theory, okay, or you will conduct research so that you will come up a theory of the possible and the most possible, the most probable explanation of that criminal activity. That's the idea, okay? So you do not have, we call it theory yet. You have initial information, okay? You have initial information about the rising cases of, we call it sexual crimes in a particular municipality. Okay, so you gather information. Okay, you have some speculations. You have some, we call it data. Okay, and then later on, as you gather information, then after collating everything, you will come up now with a theory that more or less, we call it, generally explain the cause of that criminal activity in a given municipality. That is the idea. So the theory is clearly derived from by some other means. It is now the imagination and creative insight of the innovator by which theory is developed. Okay, so you have developed. Then you can say now, say for example, if that sexual abuse or cases in a given municipality. So after gathering information, after interviewing people, after we call it gathering further evidence, and most of the respondents or most of the people claim that the women were raped because we call it lack of we call it guardians along the areas where they were raped. When I say guardians, say it could be a street light, okay, an artificial guardian, a street light, or uh, closed circuit televisions or CCTV. That could be also be a technical electronic guardian. Police officers patrolling the area, as well as other people in the area, as well as barangay patrol officers in the area. Those are the guardians. Say uh, most of the cases happened in isolated places. Then you can now make a theory that lack of guardian, okay, causes sexual assault. So that's now your theory, because that is more or less the direction where most of the we call it most of the respondents or your population in the search have noted. So that's the idea. So because of the theory now, what would be the policy that you are going to create if you are the policy maker, or if you are the chief of police, or if you are the city or the municipal mayor? So the policy now is that you are going to ask the police officer to, we call it, to activate their patrol, or to increase their visibility on areas or in isolated places. Then you may ask the engineering department to construct or build street lights. Okay, and you may ask, you may coordinate with the barangay officials to more or less instruct their barangay tanods or their barangay patrol officers to, we call it, to increase also their visibilities in criminal-prone areas. That is the idea. So further, Bernie Glaser and Anselm Strauss developed now what's called the grounded theory. The grounded theory research is it's a kind of research or a kind of study in which you are dealing with an issue in which there are we call it, there is an absence of study on that particular issue, or there are very few studies about that thing. Okay, say for example, criminal activities that we call it they are which are not yet given a focus. Say for example, women sexually abusing men. That's the idea. So we are used to men sexually abusing women. So here comes a case, and here's a case that a man was sexually abused by a woman, and in that particular incident, there are still no studies about it, about what causes women to sexually abuse the men. Okay, so you're now going to conduct a study in there, so that later on you will come up with a theory explaining the possible reason why there are women who are also sexually abusing men. So you come up with a theory. So that is what you call the grounded theory. Okay, so you are going to develop a theory in a social science. So basically, that is inspired by the inductive reasoning. So what is inductive? You do not have yet a theory, you don't have yet a conclusion, you gather information, and after gathering all the information, you analyze them, and then you try now to come up with a possible theory that could explain that phenomena. Okay, so induction will now validate the theory, meaning the gathering of information will validate your theory. Based from all the evidence, based from all the data that I've gathered, they are all pointing to that particular explanation. Okay? So it does not develop a theory, but rather it will only validate. Okay? It will only validate your theory that you have created out of the data. So it is mainly applicable for qualitative research. So when you say qualitative research, these are the researches conducted in which there is no specific, we call it assumed answers, but rather you are going to ask a person to express his or her feelings about it, or to express his or her personal insight on a particular subject, or to express her own or his or her own we call it understanding of a given phenomena, or his or her own experience. And out of those things that you have gathered from them, then now you are going to come up with a possible theory, or if you have come up with a possible theory, you call that a grounded theory. So again, so the process in theory construction in the inductive, you look across cases and data, so specific data, and then the relationship to theory, the direction now is to ground up, meaning pataas. So coming from down, coming from below, below are the data. So the direction of your study now, of your investigation of a criminal activity is going up. Okay? And you have already something like a theory in your mind, and you're now going to seek confirmation across, meaning you already have some, we call it some inference on what could be the possible theory or explanation of that criminal activity. Okay, so you confirm that. Okay, so you can conduct surveys, cases, or case studies or interviews to validate further the particular theory that you're trying to construct, because you have already what you call an initial theory on a particular criminal activity. On the grounded theory, there is no theory yet. Okay, you are trying to build up a jury. But in inductive, there are already, we call it accepted juries on a particular criminal activity. You're just trying now to gather data, across data, okay? You collate them uh, and to come up with another jury or to validate that jury. Okay, so in the deductive, on the other hand, you have now that general jury, okay? Then you go down to the particular cases. So the direction now is coming from up, going down. You explore now the necessary consequences of a rule. You explore now the jury. You explore further, okay? And you would like to validate further that jury. So if you are researching about a criminal activity, you can use the randomized control trials. What are these randomized control trials? Randomized meaning you do not have a specific subject of interview. Okay, you just pick people at random. Okay, experiments in natural and social sciences are done. You experiment in natural science, basic experiments in biology, like you have three seeds of beans. Then one is watered every day, one is watered once every 2 days, one is watered once every 3 days. Then we call it after a few days, okay? Uh, you have validated that a seed of beans should be watered every day so that it will grow. Okay, so that is the idea in the natural science. In the social science, on the other hand, is you have the theory that strict enforcement of a law, okay, reduces crime incidents. Okay, so how do you apply that in the deductive area of researching in social science? Okay, so you have district A, district B, district C, and then we call it and say district D, A to D, or 1 to 4, district 1, districts 1 to 4. So you tried now that in district 1, you applied strict implementation of an implementation of an ordinance. Okay, say an ordinance in wearing or smoking. Say for example, smoking. Okay, so another district you also conducted less strict. Okay, then a complacent one. So there's a varied, we call it implementation of that no smoking. Okay, then you came up with the findings that we call it on the district 1, in which where the implementation is the strictest, the most we call it the most stringent or the strictest means of enforcing the law. It came out that there is a significant reduction of a violation of that particular, we call it ordinance. Okay, so on the other hand, on the abductive, there is a tentative, take note of the word tentative explanation. So you have only a tentative explanation to make sense of observations for which there is no appropriate explanation yet, or rule in the existing store of knowledge. So in abductive, you are more or less open to further explanation. So your direction now, it does not start with explanation, but only a tentative explanation. Then you are now going to link together everything, okay, then generate an order that fits the surprising facts, meaning new facts, okay, at the beginning of the theory building. Okay, so you have tentative facts, tentative explanation, okay, then you move on, okay, to gather information about a criminal activity. Okay, so an example of this, we call it researches in criminology. You have the your leaning is to start up, going up. Okay, you start to go up. Okay, then as we mentioned a while back, grounded jury research, the ethnomethodology, the study of an ethnic group. Okay, and say for example, if you would like to learn how to operate a machine, if you learn how to operate a machine, You have a, we call it, you have a tentative explanation based from the user's manual. And then you manipulate now personally the, we call it the machine. Okay. Then after which you came up with the idea that how to properly, we call it manipulate or use that machine. Okay. So sometimes there is what you call the hypothesis-free A/B testing, or in other words, a kind of research that there is no hypothesis yet. So, say for example, you would like to design a crime prevention activity in a particular municipality. So, the abductive could be a good example. Or you are trying to conduct a constructive research design, okay? Meaning you would like to come up with a policy, or we call it an action plan for a particular community or a particular organization, or you would like to come up with a prototype of a machine or a prototype of an equipment, or you'd like to conduct cultural proofs, meaning in a particular cultural community or culture, you would like to we call it come up with an explanation of a particular cultural practice. So what is hypothesis? Again, hypothesis is a part of some theory structure. It could be a theory itself, or it could be a part of the theory structure. Okay? Hypothesis meaning those are the initial assumptions that you're going to, we call it to state at the beginning of your study of a criminal activity. Say there is a rising incidence of, we call it corruption in a given university. So you have now, we call it, what are the assumptions that you can make? What are the hypotheses that you can make? These are hypotheses based from other researches. Okay? They are nothing more than the opinion of the researcher. So it could be your own opinion, or it could be based from, we call it, other researches. It could be your own opinion. Okay? Then it is a tentative assumption made in order to draw out and test its logical or empirical consequence according to Merriam-Webster. It is this process of hypothesis creation that has resulted in numerous tests. So you are now going to test your hypothesis by conducting researches. Okay? Then later on, okay, your theory, meaning, as I mentioned a while back, your hypothesis could be based from theories. It could be based from theory. So there's a theory that job satisfaction increases efficiency of employers or employees. So from that, say for example, you are conducting a particular research in a certain police station. So you may say that the police officers are satisfied with their work. Then the second hypothesis now is that the police officers are efficient in their work. Okay, so you came up with that hypothesis or assumption in that research, okay, on the job satisfaction of police officers in given municipality, and you base that from a standard theory that there is a correlation between job satisfaction, and job efficiency. Okay, so hypotheses do not create theory, because they could also be, we call it, a personal theory of the researcher, or of the proponent of a research. So this is how you develop now a theory from an inductive reasoning, or from a grounded theory reasoning. Okay, so first you have the research design, meaning when you say research design, am I going to conduct, we call it qualitative, quantitative research? Okay, so that is the idea of research design. So you now try to come up with the research question, or what you call the statement of the problem. So the statement of the problem could be, what are the causes of drug addiction? Okay, what are the causes of drug addiction? Okay, so this could be your startup statement of statement, okay, or statement of the problem, and the main concepts and variables involved. So the main concept that you are studying is about drug addiction and about the causes of drug addiction. Then after that, you gather now data, collect data using any method. It could be an interview, field research, survey, like that. Okay. Then you try now to arrange your data. You arrange the data. You may, if that is qualitative research, you will come up with a thematic analysis, as you call that. Okay, in which you are going to group similar teams like that, or under sub teams, or if you are doing quantitative research, you may arrange your data by ascending to descending. Okay, then after which, after you have arranged all the data, you are now going to analyze. When you say analyze, try to look now for a pattern. Okay, when you say pattern, which one is the highest among the variables, or among the data, or among the causes that you have found? Okay, are there any connections to that? What are the significant findings? And then from data analysis, you can come up now with your conclusion or with your theory, basing from the patterns and the basing from the analysis that you have done in your data. And of course, to come up further, you may come up with literature comparison, meaning you try now to compare with emerging theory with the existing literature, meaning you come up with your theory, a grounded theory, or a conclusion to the phenomena. Then you try now to compare that with existing literatures relative or related to your study. Okay, so finally, here's a question. What kind of reasoning is used in everyday living? Okay, uh, the answer is that inductive reasoning. More or less, we use that in our life, no? Why? Because practically we have partial knowledge about something. In everyday life, because most of the world is based on partial knowledge and based from partial probabilities and the usefulness of a theory as opposed to its absolute validity, and not deduction, because it is hard to use in everyday life because it will require a sequential set of facts that are known to be true. So it is easier to come up with an inductive, meaning partial explanation, or come up with partial information as we work on with something. Okay, so that's the idea. Before coming up with a generic conclusion to your study or to your work. And another thing, if you are going to apply deductive, the problem there is it may be filled with biases or partialities, because you are just, we call it, dealing with we call it with your assumption. Okay, you would like to work on you would like to work on you would like to go on things that will support only your we call it your biases. That's the idea on the deductive. So deductive, what kind of reasoning is usually used by most criminological theories? Well, deductive. Why deductive? Because we have already most, take note of most, no? Okay, because today there are already standard theories that were created after 100 years of criminology, or the criminological science. Okay, from the time of we call it the classical school, the time of Cesar Beccaria up to this our contemporary time. Okay, there are already hundreds or perhaps thousands of criminological theories, but hundreds of theories. Okay, so there are already theories that we have. So basically, in our time, we normally start with those standard theories as we study. Although today, there are we call it there are some who are doing grounded theory or inductive research. Okay, but in actuality or in reality, uh, the idea of criminal activity in the world more or less it's already something like exhausted, meaning nakita na yung mga possible causes ng criminality. Kaya ang ginagawa na lang natin ngayon when we study crime or when we conduct research, we normally have a conceptual framework based from standard theories. Okay? And we try now to validate those theories by a specific study that we are doing or we will be doing in our community. Okay? So, deduction has theories that predict an outcome. Meaning, meron na kasi tayong mga standard theories. Unless mag-grounded theory tayo kung yung criminal activity na yan ay wala pang standard theory na nag-govern sa particular criminal activity na yan. But otherwise, mas marami sa criminological studies natin na nag-start tayo sa mga standard theories and trying to validate these theories by conducting researches in specific communities or specific organizations.